ahead and open your next lesson, Prison Camps. Our objectives for this lesson are to know the plans put forth of Civil War prisons, cite examples of prison life in general, describe what happened at the Anderson and Elmira prisons. Look at your vocabulary words. Shocking or cruel acts, especially an act of wanton violence against an enemy in wartime, are atrocities. An officer in command of a military establishment is a commandant. Being confined, especially during wartime, is interned. A toilet, especially a communal one on a military base, is a latrine. A disease brought on by a lack of vitamin C is scurvy. Okay, look at your comic. Looks like both the birds are in prison now. Looks like they have striped clothes. Looks like they have a hat. There's bars in the windows. They're looking at each other through a barred window in the door. Okay. Most plans are just inaccurate predictions. Ben Bale. It is safe to say that life rarely turns out the way it was planned. Without fail, something happens that completely throws everything helter-skelter. A friend sets you up with a blind date, and you, knowing that blind dates usually end up being duds, terribly underdress. When you answer the knock on the door, there stands Prince Charming, all decked out in the latest suit. Or maybe you barely practice your songs for the Battle of the Bands because you heard only one other band is showing up, and they're terrible. You arrive and find out, to your horror, there are actually 10 bands, and 6 of them are really good. These examples briefly point out that plans, like the quote above states, often are inaccurate predictions. You just never know what to expect. The lesson today illustrates this point. Unfortunately, the lessons learned had severe consequences for thousands, resulting in their deaths. As the Civil War unfolded, both sides initially felt it would not last long. The South underestimated the North's desire to preserve the Union. The North underestimated the South's resolve to be rid of federal policies that hindered states' rights. As a result, neither side expected to hold a great number of prisoners. Although they understood there would be prisoners of war, or POWs, both figured on relatively small numbers. In addition, both sides assumed that prisoners would be treated with courtesy and allowed to return to their respective sides, especially since the war would be fairly short. First Shiloh, then Bull Run, and Antietam changed that misguided thinking. The war was not going to end overnight. There were going to be thousands of POWs. There was no place to house such numbers. Prisons had been constructed, to be sure, but not on the scale required by these and other terrible battles. As a result of poor planning, the prisoner of war camps on both sides became many times worse than the actual battles. So today we're going to talk about prison life. Okay. Go ahead and put your date on your paper. You're going to need a lot of room today. We haven't done a web in a while, so I figured we'd do a web today. This is called Prison Life. For most men captured by enemy forces, the journey usually began in a holding pen near the battlefield. Their names and what unit they belonged to would be written down, and then they would be removed to the rear. Eventually, the POWs arrived at one of the 150 places that were used by the two sides as prisons during the war. Okay. So first, they went to a holding pen. I'm going to put holding pen. They went to a holding pen. It says they wrote down their names and the unit they belonged to. Okay, so they wrote down their names. And units. Eventually, the POWs arrived at one of the 150 places that were used by the two sides as prisons during the war. Okay. So after they were in the holding pen, there's 150 different prison camps. Okay. On both sides, prison conditions were terrible. Nearly all of them were overcrowded. Okay, they were overcrowded. If you've ever watched those prison shows on TV, how they're overcrowded. Of course, it was a lot worse than that, but few provided decent housing, clothing, food, or medical attention. As the war progressed and supplies became harder to get, especially in the South, prisoners were the last ones to receive provisions of any kind. Okay. So they're the last to receive provisions. Because like we read before, the soldiers are fed first. They're the last ones to eat, the last ones to get any clothes, and the last ones to get any medical attention. So they probably didn't get any medical attention. As the war progressed and supplies became harder to get, especially in the South, prisoners were the last to receive provisions of any kind. By the war's end, 26,000 of the 215,000 Confederate prisoners and 30,000 of the 190,000 Federal prisoners had died. Okay. So the Confederates, it said 26,000 out of 215,000 died. Okay, and it said Federal prisoners, okay, so the North, or the Feds, it said 30,000 of the 190,000. Okay, and these are the amount of prisoners that died. Okay, and it said they died because of lack of provisions. They didn't get the food they needed. They didn't get any medical attention. And a lot of them actually just starved to death. A shortage of supplies may have been a contributing factor in the South, but this could not be an excuse to the North. Okay? So, in the South, it's because of lack of supplies. But why did that many die in the North? Sorry, I lost my place. In some cases, like the prison at Fort Delaware, the commandant refused to purchase the necessary supplies, even though ample money to do so was available. So at Fort Delaware, it's just because the commandant refused to purchase it. I don't want to put this. Commandant refused. It's not because they couldn't afford it. It's not because they didn't have the supplies. He just refused to get any. Some commandants were horrified by the conditions they saw daily and tried to do whatever they could. So just because this fort he refused, a lot of the other commandants at the different prisons They did everything they could to help their prisoners. Most often enough, the prison officials did little to make life better for those who were interned. In reality, many officials were unfit for their post. They did not have the knowledge or skills needed to take on such a duty. In other cases, they did not want to help the enemy. Typically, prison diets included cornmeal, salted pork, or beef. Okay, so food. And it sounds a lot like what the soldiers were eating, didn't it? It said cornmeal, salted pork, or beef, salted beef, and bread. On occasion, prisoners received some vegetables to ward off scurvy, but that was rare. So every once in a while they would get vegetables. As the war dragged on, the quality of food deteriorated. The meat given to men was sometimes rotten by the time they received it. Soup was no more than spiced water. Worms and maggots were in virtually everything they ate. So it got to the point where their food was spoiled and it had maggots in it. Okay. Spoiled and it had maggots. Two prisons were especially known for atrocities committed against prisoners of war. The Confederacy's Andersonville and the Union's Elmira. Together they accounted for the deaths of thousands. So it said prison life. It said first they went into a holding pen where they took their names and what unit they were in. There was 150 different prison camps. They were overcrowded. They were the last to receive any provisions. By the end of the war, 26,000 prisoners died in the Confederate prisons. 30,000 died in the federal prisons. In Fort Delaware, the commandant just refused to help them. And he wasn't the only one. There were many people that just didn't want to help themselves. The food they ate was usually cornmeal, salted pork and beef, bread, and every once in a while vegetables. But as the war dragged on, it got to the point where the meat was spoiled and it had maggots in it. Okay, and it said that there were two prisons that were especially horrid. And the first one we're going to talk about is Andersonville. Andersonville. As the Civil War progressed and more prisoners were being taken, there became a need for additional facilities to house POWs, or prisoners of war. Andersonville, a small town in southern Georgia, was chosen as a site for one of these prisons. An area of land with a small stream running through the middle was chosen as the prison's location. In the spring of 1864, the prison, officially known as Camp Sumter, was ready to receive prisoners. Okay, so this is called Camp Sumter. Camp is there a P there? Sumter. Okay, Camp Sumter. The prison was originally designed to house no more than 10,000, but by August, more than 32,000 prisoners were detained there. So it's overcrowded. Up to this time, there had been a prison exchange program in effect between the two sides. The program broke down when Confederate soldiers allegedly mistreated some black POWs. Okay, so there used to be a prisoner exchange program. I'll put it up here. So there used to be a prisoner exchange You give me one of my prisoners, and I'll give you one of yours. Okay, but it said that the Confederates allegedly mistreated some black prisoner of war. General Grant refused to continue the exchange program unless there were some guarantee that black POWs would be treated the same as whites. When this request was rejected, the system fell apart, and the number of prisoners greatly increased. By the summer of 1864, Andersonville Prison had been enlarged in size from about 16 acres to 26 acres. So it went from, originally it was 16 acres, and it was increased to 26 acres. They have a lot more POWs than they expected. Even then, it was not nearly large enough to accommodate so many men. The creek running through the middle of the camp offered the men a source of fresh water, but it quickly became polluted, as it also acted as a latrine to remove human waste. For your information, scurvy is caused by a lack of vitamin C. In extreme cases, it causes sores, loss of teeth, and depression. Scurvy has been known since at least 400 BC. James Lind, a Scottish surgeon, first discovered the disease could be cured by eating citrus fruit around 1750. Except in those nations with high populations suffering from malnutrition, scurvy is rarely seen today. As the economic condition of the Confederacy fell apart, so did the situation at the prison. Too many men were crowded into too small an area. Because most had no shelter whatsoever, sickness such as scurvy, diarrhea, dysentery, and gangrene became rampant. Whenever you have a limb that dies, it gets gangrene in it. That means that something's dead in your body. Those in charge of the prison lacked the ability and materials to treat so many people, and as a result, a large number of the sick died. Altogether, more than 12,000 perished at that prison. So at Anderson, they had 12,000 deaths. 12,000 died of sickness. When the war ended in April of 1865, Andersonville Commandant Henry Wirz was arrested and charged with war crimes. So Henry Wirz, Okay, and he was arrested and charged with war crimes. Wirz claimed he was only acting under orders and that the conditions at Andersonville were not of his choosing. Although many believed this to be true, Wirz was found guilty on a number of other counts, sentenced to death, and hanged. He was the only person to be executed for war crimes as a result of the conflict. Okay, he was charged with war crimes. Okay, he was found guilty and he was hanged. He was the commandant of Andersonville.